What I get a little bit from what you said, but also what Justin Lin said yesterday is, okay, probably it's not only the government, it might be the government, but sometimes the market is just deciding, or the private sector. Let the private sector start and let's see what they are doing and where they are going. So I would like to ask Tata, how do you decide in which country you go or with which companies you are working? What are the prerequisites that you need from a private sector view?
To give a very broad kind of indication on selection of partners, I would say values will come first. Are we having shared values, both in terms of the technology they are using as well as the Tata-ness, the Tata way and the Tata-ness integrate properly? The second is, what is the, more than the business opportunity, is there any achievement beyond opportunity? Opportunism gives us some quick revenue to become sustainable because, as I said, we are businesses. So from a mode of business, one has to talk about opportunism, but that will always come second to a sense of achievement and fulfillment. That can we make a difference in the lives of those who really need us? And we are not imposing ourselves on them. They have called us, and therefore we try to go. But I would like to say one thing which I can sort of bring into this question as well as in my previous one about the supply chain management. We have to have a business model that really is inclusive, and therefore business is seen as a force for good. In other words, profits are required, but is there a purpose of profit? And that has to go down the chain into the supplier thing, which means that if you continue to do CSR, and somehow this word CSR has stuck into the minds of policymakers, governments, private agencies, and they are still talking about mandating some percentage of profit, which is, I think, ridiculous, because it is they just don't seem to get the point. The whole world CSR is not more than 1% of profit. And with these little crumbs that you put, after saying the rest of the profit is yours first, I think we have no moral authority to say that we are making any change in the society. But instead, if you look at the whole stakeholder areas, like, in procurement, is there any alternate procurement I can do? In other words, instead of giving a charity check to an NGO, why don't you give a purchase order? There's a place where they were having dyslexic children, just 10 numbers, whom we trained in computer data processing. Today, we are able to call for 150 of them overnight. The whole Tata group under the CSR were not able to produce even about 3,000 self-help groups. But when Tata AIG went into the supply chain, in 1 year, they produced 50,000 self-help groups. So there is a shift from scarcity to abundance. There is a shift from profit orientation and making profit as a means, and that the whole business is a force for good. And you have to find alternate human resources. You have to, the way Titan, brought in disability sector right about 30 years ago, when there was none of this talk about sustainability or CSR, they brought in about 25% of their workforce was disabled. So inclusive business models are required. The shift from scarcity to abundance is important. We should stop looking at profit as a dirty word, make it a means towards a greater end.
Thank you. Mr. Nuru, Ethiopia, foreign direct investment. What are your experiences?
We have a steady flow of FDI investment. We are laying the basic ground, actually, that attracts FDI. One is, as John Page said, actually developing the SCEs is one of the instruments that cuts cost, integrates company process as well. The advantage of what we have is also being latecomers, we are learning from others. What we observed is actually particularly EPZs that are 100% focused on export somehow are prone to vulnerability. So instead of simply focusing SEZs on export, they should cater to domestic linkage as well. But the critical point is linking with SMEs and indigenous industries so that we can establish a linkage to local development as well. That is key. And I think particularly investors from abroad, FDI, should first understand and realize what the policies and the strategies of indigenous governments are. One case and example I can raise here is, as I said, we are looking for value addition. We have resources that we used to export as a raw material. Then we started the value addition process. And in the leather industry, we said we are no longer going to export raw hide and skin, which they call it wet blue. We should move it upscale and add value, and let us export semi-processed, what they call crust. And everyone in Europe and other countries that used to import raw materials started getting angry, saying they are not going to trade with us. And they said, this is our policy. We need to transfer the value addition to the poor in our country. And we also need to develop the industry, the manufacturing industry as well. This is not a complex industry. It's simply tanning. The next stage is just shoemaking. So for a few months, the export market fell down. We had trouble, but we insisted on our principle. And finally, they chose two things. One, they started coming to Ethiopia with their technology and the production process, and starting actually moving their technology as well. Now, we are having both market as well as technology transfer. The next stage should be, how do they link with the local industries? That is very basic. Either through joint venture or linkage with the SMEs, it is critical that we create corporate companies that are also citizens of the community as well. That is very basic. On the government side, the biggest challenge was actually infrastructure. As earlier indicated, first we need to link our resource areas, the agriculture sector, the rural areas with the industry centers as well. Then we look into also linking to the regional areas next. I think it can go parallel together. The other challenge is actually how do you harmonize your industrialization and development policies? That's something to look into as well. I met friends from Eastern African Association that was just established, and all are agricultural based. In some cases, even their comparative advantage is the same. How do you differentiate and integrate an economy that actually adds value when you somehow widen your boundary? That's, I think, something that I and others need to think about so that we can really have a fruitful regional integration. That's my comment.
Thank you. Now I have the feeling we are really just getting into the subject, but the clock tells me that we soon have to finish. So I would like to open the discussion to the floor, and I think we can do 1 or 2 rounds of questions depending on questions. Okay.
The question is, you have got your own funding agency, namely Dorabji Tata Trust or Ratan Tata Trust, which basically does not, it is not the CSR activity, but it's a funding agency for the NGOs. So have you seen these kind of collaboration being percolated down to with your partners in other South countries like South Africa or other countries?
Yeah. As I said earlier, the Tata Group is owned by Tata Trust. And 66% of Tata's wealth is the endowment from which the interests come out to serve the communities. In all these years, the domestic need has been such that we have really not focused outside because our businesses were also not spreading outside. Even today, the domestic demand is humongous, And the trusts are controlled by, thought leaders within the country. And therefore, there has been a certain amount of bias. But recently, in collaboration with other trusts, the Tata trusts have tried to, say for instance, in the United Kingdom, because we have about 50,000 employees there, and today Tata's total employment percentage is about 60 coming from outside India. So there is a thought of expanding the access of trust. But given the exchange parity and things like that, we'll have to be very imaginative on the use of money for trying to do something that will pilot a very unique or a novel initiative rather than the scale part of it. So I hope we create also knowledge, as you said, Mr. Page, that the knowledge itself is humongous. That could be shared, which has been now shared even more than before. Along with that, some funds for trying out something novel is likely to happen.
Okay, if there are no more further questions, I would like to say a last thing or tell a very short anecdote that I had in Benin, because, as I said, the Beninese, they were trying very hard to identify, besides cotton, another area, another sector where they could be active. And they saw that they had really a lot of tomatoes. But tomatoes, like mangoes, that were proposed yesterday, are only ripe at a certain season. So when the time arrives, all the roads in Benin are really red because of all the tomatoes that are just lying next to the street, hoping to be sold. Most of them won't be sold. You know this problem. So they thought, okay, we use a lot of tomato concentrate and for our cooking, so we should produce it on our own. We will set up a company that produces tomato concentrate. And they were thinking about the business plan, but then they discovered, as they have no industry to produce tins or glasses or other containers, that it is more expensive to import the empty containers than containers already filled with tomato concentrate from Turkey or even Italy. This is all a question also about economies of scale, and this is such a complicated issue for the smaller countries and even some of the larger ones that are focusing mainly on one only industry. Lots of things still to be discussed, lots of questions about regional economic integration, trade barriers, etc. But for me, one of the big points, especially for low-income countries, is where to start from. If there is nobody coming from the outside and saying, hey, I think that we could do cars or shoes or steel or whatever, and as John Page said, mainly it needs clusters, or some industries attract others, but if you don't have a seed, it might be difficult. But to get export zones going is difficult as well. We had a poverty impact assessment on an export zone in Senegal, and it showed that the problems would probably be larger than the profits from the export zone. Poverty problems, migration problems, and how to attract at once a larger group of industries settling in a country. And I hope one day we will find out. Well, I thank our panel for the very interesting inputs. I would like to continue this discussion further on, and all the very best to Ethiopia. They already found some sectors, and hopefully that will work. Thank you so much. And before, oops.